The clink of a fork against a plate was the only sound that dared to break the velvet quiet of the Sterling grill, but it was a man's voice, loud and dismissive, that shattered it completely. "Is this a joke?" he boomed, his words aimed like a weapon at Ava. She stood frozen, the neck of the 1982 Chateau Margaux feeling slick with sweat in her grip. Her mind raced, replaying every step, the presentation, the decanting, but found no error. Yet the tech mogul's face was a mask of theatrical disgust, his performance for the man at the head of the table, Julian Thorne. All eyes in the opulent dining room, once veiled in polite indifference, were now fixed on her, a specimen of shame under the warm, unforgiving lights. Her career, her future, was evaporating in the suffocating silence that followed. But the silence that followed held a judgment far heavier than any flawed vintage, a silence that would shatter her life forever. If you want to witness the moment everything changed, watch until the end. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments what you would have done. Ava, at 28, was more than a sommelier. She was a custodian of stories trapped in glass. Each bottle held a history, a season of sun and struggle she understood intimately. This position at the Sterling Grill was not merely a job. It was the culmination of a desperate climb out of a life defined by her father's honorable failure and the mountain of debt he left behind. She had learned to move with a quiet grace that made her nearly invisible, a silent servant to the city's elite. Her dignity was her only real possession, a fragile inheritance she polished daily. And now, a brutish man was attempting to smudge it with his unearned power, right in front of the one man whose opinion could unmake worlds. The restaurant itself was a world built on hushed power. Amber light bled from shaded sconces, catching the sharp edges of crystal glasses and the deep gloss of mahogany paneling. The air, thick with the scent of seared prime beef and old money, was a constant reminder of her place. Here, conversations were murmurs, deals were sealed with a subtle nod, and fortunes were decided between the soup and the entree. Ava navigated this space with the precision of a dancer, her senses attuned to the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the unspoken tensions that vibrated just beneath the surface of polite society. She was an outsider permitted to witness the machinations of the powerful, so long as she never made them feel seen. Her solitude was a constant companion, a quiet ache that sharpened in the empty echo of her small apartment after a long shift. The city's distant hum did little to fill the void left by a family fractured by loss. She carried her integrity like a shield, a stubborn moral code inherited from a father who believed in honor above all else, a belief that ultimately led to his ruin. This unwavering sense of right and wrong made her feel ancient and out of place in a world that rewarded compromise and celebrated ruthlessness. She was surrounded by people, but profoundly alone, her inner world a stark contrast to the performative confidence of the patrons she served every night, men who saw her as nothing more than a pair of hands. The pressure was a physical weight on her shoulders. Her manager, a man with a smile that never reached his predatory eyes, watched her every move, waiting for a mistake. The rent was always looming, a dark cloud on the horizon, and the cost of her mother's care was a constant gnawing anxiety. Each perfect pour, each correctly identified vintage was a small victory in a relentless war against failure. She couldn't afford a single misstep. This job was her only lifeline, the one solid piece of ground in a life that felt like it was slowly sinking. The public humiliation wasn't just an insult, it was a direct threat to her very survival, a reminder of how easily her carefully constructed world could be torn apart by the whim of a powerful man. As she stood there, paralyzed by the weight of 100 indifferent gazes, the mogul's triumphant smirk twisting his features, she felt a shift in the room's energy. It was a subtle change, a sudden drop in the atmospheric pressure. The other guests at the table looked down at their plates, feigning interest in their food, embarrassed for her but unwilling to intervene. Only one person remained perfectly still, his attention unwavering. Julian Thorne hadn't moved a muscle. He wasn't looking at his guest or the wine. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on her. It wasn't a look of anger or pity. It was something else entirely. A deep, unnerving assessment that seemed to peel back every layer of her composure, searching for the core of her. And in that gaze, she felt a new kind of fear. The journey home was a descent from one world to another. Ava traded the hushed opulence of the Sterling Grill for the rattling, fluorescent-lit reality of the late-night city bus. Through the rain-streaked window, the glittering towers of Manhattan blurred into abstract streaks of gold and silver, symbols of a life she served but could never touch. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wool and exhaustion, a collective sigh from a city that never truly slept. She clutched the strap of her worn leather bag, her knuckles white, feeling the invisible wall between herself and the world outside. Each bump and screech of the brakes was a reminder of her own precarious trajectory, a life lived on the margins of other people's comfort, always one misstep away from falling off the edge completely. Her apartment, a small studio in a pre-war building with temperamental plumbing, was her only sanctuary. It was meticulously clean, a testament to her need for order in a life that felt perpetually chaotic. A single, well-tended orchid sat on the windowsill, its fragile beauty a quiet act of defiance against the grime of the city. On the small kitchen counter, a stack of envelopes, bills, final notices, a letter from her mother's nursing home sat like a monument to her anxieties. She would light a single candle, its soft glow pushing back the shadows, and for a few moments she could pretend this small space was a home and not just a place to rest before the next battle. It was here, in the profound silence, that the weight of her solitude was most acute. The ritual of removing her uniform was a slow, deliberate shedding of a skin that wasn't hers. The crisp, black fabric felt like armor, but it was also a cage, dictating her posture, her movements, her very identity for 12 hours a day. She would unbutton the stiff collar, feeling the release of a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The faint scent of expensive wine, seared steak, and other people's perfume clung to the material, a ghost of the world she'd just left behind. Hanging it carefully in the closet, she was no longer Ava the sommelier, the silent, efficient servant. She was just Ava, a woman burdened by the legacy of a good man who had lost everything, trying. Each bump and screech of the brakes was a reminder of her own precarious trajectory, a life lived on the margins of other people's comfort, always one misstep away from falling off the edge completely. Her apartment, a small studio in a pre-war building with temperamental plumbing, was her only sanctuary. It was meticulously clean, a testament to her need for order in a life that felt perpetually chaotic. A single, well-tended orchid sat on the windowsill, its fragile beauty a quiet act of defiance against the grime of the city. On the small kitchen counter, a stack of envelopes, bills, final notices, a letter from her mother's nursing home, sat like a monument to her anxieties. She would light a single candle, its soft glow pushing back the shadows, and for a few moments she could pretend this small space was a home and not just a place to rest before the next battle. It was here, in the profound silence, that the weight of her solitude was most acute. The ritual of removing her uniform was a slow, deliberate shedding of a skin that wasn't hers. The crisp black fabric felt like armor, but it was also a cage, dictating her posture, her movements, her very identity for 12 hours a day. She would unbutton the stiff collar, feeling the release of a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The faint scent of expensive wine, seared steak, and other people's perfume clung to the material, a ghost of the world she'd just left behind. Hanging it carefully in the closet, she was no longer Ava the sommelier, the silent, efficient servant. She was just Ava, a woman burdened by the legacy of a good man who had lost everything, trying desperately not to suffer the same fate. Her mother's voice on the phone was a fragile thread connecting her to a past filled with warmth and light. Now it was strained, clouded by the fog of illness and the sterile scent of the facility she called home. Ava would listen, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten, as her mother recounted the small details of her day. She never spoke of the mounting bills or the threatening letters from the administration. She would promise to visit soon, her voice bright and reassuring, a performance of stability for the woman who once had been her rock. Each call ended with a familiar ache in her chest, a mixture of love and the crushing guilt of not being able to provide more, of not being able to bring her home. The ghost of her father was a constant presence in her quiet moments. He had been a watchmaker, a man who believed in precision, honor, and the inherent value of a job done with integrity. He refused to cut corners, to compromise his craft for profit, and in a world that valued speed over substance, his principles led him to ruin. He left her with nothing but his debts and an unshakable moral compass that felt more like a curse than a gift. She saw his tired, honorable eyes in her own reflection, and she fought every day to uphold his values while simultaneously resenting them for making her so ill-equipped for the ruthless world she now inhabited. His failure was the cautionary tale that fueled her relentless drive. At the restaurant, the oppression was more refined, but no less suffocating. Her manager, Mr. Davies, moved through the dining room with a practiced, predatory grace. He never raised his voice, but his disapproval was a physical force, delivered through a tight smile or a lingering, critical gaze that made her feel small and incompetent. He would find fault in the smallest details, the angle of a glass, a moment of hesitation in her service. He seemed to relish her quiet dignity, viewing it as a challenge to be broken. His constant scrutiny was a war of attrition, designed to wear down her confidence until she was nothing more than a compliant, fearful employee, another cog in his perfectly polished machine of service. Late at night, surrounded by her textbooks and vintage charts, Ava allowed herself to dream. She would trace the wine regions of Burgundy and Tuscany with her finger, imagining the scent of damp earth and sun-ripened grapes. Her secret ambition wasn't wealth or power, but a small plot of land, a vineyard of her own, where she could create something true and lasting. It was a foolish, impossible fantasy, a fragile hope she nurtured in the darkness like a clandestine love affair. This dream was the core of her, the part of her soul that the city, the debts, and the condescending smiles of powerful men had not yet managed to tarnish. It was the reason she endured, the silent promise she made to herself that this was not her final chapter. The relentless pressure of her financial reality was a low, constant hum of anxiety beneath the surface of her composure. She lived a life of careful calculations, foregoing small pleasures to ensure the nursing home check would clear. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a constant companion that whispered of eviction, of failure, of letting down the one person who depended on her completely. It made her cautious and risk-averse, forcing her to swallow insults and endure humiliation with a placid smile. Her integrity was the only luxury she could afford, but she was beginning to wonder how long she could hold on to it when survival demanded such a high price, a price that was paid in small pieces of her soul every single day. Tonight, the air in the Sterling Grill was different, charged with an electric tension that seemed to emanate from a single table in the corner, Julian Thorne's table. Mr. Davies had been clear. Everything must be flawless. Do not make me regret trusting you with this. The words hung in the air, a direct threat. As Ava approached the table, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the restaurant's soft jazz. She focused on the ritual, the familiar steps of presenting the wine, a lifeline of professionalism in a sea of fear. She could feel Thorne's eyes on her, an unnervingly perceptive gaze that saw far more than just a sommelier performing her duties. He saw the tremor in her hand she was trying so desperately to hide. Then it happened. The loud, dismissive voice of the tech mogul cut through the room's decorum like a shard of broken glass. His accusation of a flawed vintage was a performance, and she was the unwilling prop. A hot wave of shame washed over her as every head turned in her direction. In that moment, she was no longer a professional. She was a spectacle of failure. Her carefully constructed composure shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable under the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes. The silence that followed was a physical blow, and in that suffocating void, her gaze drifted, helplessly, to the head of the table. Julian Thorne's expression was unreadable, a mask of cold neutrality, yet his eyes held hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw not judgment, but the calm before a devastating storm. The silence stretched. Tonight, the air in the Sterling Grill was different, charged with an electric tension that seemed to emanate from a single table in the corner. Julian Thorne's table. Mr. Davies had been clear. Everything must be flawless. Do not make me regret trusting you with this. The words hung in the air, a direct threat. As Ava approached the table, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the restaurant's soft jazz. She focused on the ritual, the familiar steps of presenting the wine, a lifeline of professionalism in a sea of fear. She could feel Thorne's eyes on her, an unnervingly perceptive gaze that saw far more than just a sommelier performing her duties. He saw the tremor in her hand she was trying so desperately to hide. Then it happened. The loud, dismissive voice of the tech mogul cut through the room's decorum like a shard of broken glass. His accusation of a flawed vintage was a performance, and she was the unwilling prop. A hot wave of shame washed over her as every head turned in her direction. In that moment, she was no longer a professional. She was a spectacle of failure. Her carefully constructed composure shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable under the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes. The silence that followed was a physical blow, and in that suffocating void, her gaze drifted, helplessly, to the head of the table. Julian Thorne's expression was unreadable, a mask of cold neutrality, yet his eyes held hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw not judgment, but the calm before a devastating storm. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, threatening to snap under the weight of Julian Thorne's stillness. He sat at the head of the table, a figure carved from shadow and stillness, his presence a void that pulled all the room's light and sound into itself. Ava watched him, unable to look away, her own humiliation a distant echo against the roaring fear he inspired. He wore a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the ambient glow of the chandeliers, tailored with a precision that spoke not of wealth, but of absolute, terrifying control. His hands rested on the table, one over the other, perfectly composed. Only the faintest silver of a scar near his knuckle betrayed any history of violence, a flaw in the otherwise immaculate and dangerous perfection of the man. Then, with a movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible, he acted. He did not speak. He did not look at the blustering tech mogul who had been the source of her shame. Julian Thorne simply lifted his chin, a fractional, deliberate motion, and his eyes, cold as a winter sea, narrowed slightly. It was not a gesture of threat, but one of finality, a silent command that carried more weight than any shouted order. The mogul's tirade faltered, his bravado evaporating like mist. He swallowed, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, absolute quiet. The man's face, once flushed with triumphant arrogance, paled to a sickly white. He had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed, and the consequence was this suffocating, absolute silence. The atmosphere in the dining room had shifted irrevocably. The other guests at the table, powerful men in their own right, suddenly seemed small, their gazes fixed on their plates as if the intricate patterns of the china held the secrets to their survival. The focus was no longer on Ava's supposed failure. She was merely the catalyst, the incidental trigger for a display of power that was raw and chilling. She felt a strange, dizzying sense of detachment, as if she were watching a scene from a film. She had been saved from a public flogging, but the man who had saved her was infinitely more terrifying than the one who had sought to humiliate her. Her relief was instantly consumed by a new, more profound and primal fear. His gaze, which had been fixed on his guest, now returned to her. It was heavy, an assessing weight that traveled over her, seeing not the trembling sommelier, but something deeper. It was a look of unnerving perception, as if he could see the stubborn spine of integrity holding her upright beneath the starched uniform, as if he recognized the quiet defiance in her eyes that refused to be extinguished by shame. She felt stripped bare, not of her clothes, but of her pretenses. He saw her fear, her pride, and her solitude, and in his cold, unblinking stare, she felt a flicker of something that was not pity, but a dark, unsettling recognition. It was a connection she didn't understand and desperately did not want. He made another gesture, a slight inclination of his head toward a heavy, unmarked oak door behind him. It was a silent summons, an undeniable command. Instantly, Mr. Davies appeared at her elbow, his face ashen, his usual predatory confidence gone. "Miss," he whispered, his voice trembling, "Mr. Thorne would like a word." In his study, the words hung in the air, a death sentence and a reprieve all at once. Ava's legs felt like lead, but she moved, propelled by a force beyond her own will. She was no longer in control of her own destiny. It had been claimed by the silent man at the head of the table, and she was terrified of where he was leading her. The short walk from the dining room to the study felt like a mile. The plush, crimson carpet absorbed the sound of her footsteps, creating an eerie silence that amplified the frantic beating of her own heart. She was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his table as she passed, the subtle, clean scent of expensive wool, and something else, something metallic and cold. She did not dare to look at him, but she could feel his eyes on her back, a physical pressure guiding her forward. The hushed conversations of the other diners died as she passed, their curiosity a palpable wave of energy. She was moving from one world into another, leaving the familiar territory of service and entering the dark, unknown domain of absolute power. The oak door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click of the lock. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence, sealing her inside, cutting her off from the world she knew. The ambient noise of the restaurant vanished, replaced by a profound, library-like quiet. The room was his sanctuary, an extension of his own being. Walls were lined with dark mahogany shelves filled with leather-bound books, not for show, but for reading. A single lamp cast a pool of warm light on a massive desk, leaving the rest of the room in deep, comfortable shadow. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and whiskey. It was a space of immense, controlled power, and she was an intruder in its heart. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that belied his size. He didn't come toward her, but walked to a small, concealed bar, his back to her for a moment. The perfect cut of his jacket did little to hide the coiled strength in his shoulders. As he reached for a crystal decanter, the cuff of his shirt slid back, revealing a sliver of a complex, dark tattoo coiling around his wrist before he adjusted it, hiding it once more. It was a brief, accidental glimpse into a world she couldn't begin to imagine, a world of violence and secrets hidden beneath the veneer of bespoke suits and silent authority. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested he never wasted a single gesture or a single thought. When he turned, he held 2 glasses, not one. He hadn't poured for himself, but for them both. He still hadn't spoken, but his actions were a language all their own. He set one glass down on the edge of the desk, a silent offering, before meeting her eyes across the shadowed expanse of the room. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with questions, with unspoken threats, and a terrifying magnetic pull. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She was a mouse in a lion's den, and the lion was not angry, but something far more dangerous. Interested. He was studying her, and she had no idea if she was passing or failing his silent, inscrutable test. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was exactly as she had imagined it would be, a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room, calm and devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of a final judgment. The wine was never the problem, he said, his gaze never leaving hers. The words were not an apology or a comfort. They were a statement of fact, dismissing the entire incident with an indifferent wave of his hand. He had not saved her out of kindness. He had corrected an imbalance, an offense against an unwritten code she was not privy to. In that moment, Ava understood. Her ordeal in the dining room was over, but a far more dangerous and complicated one had just begun. She returned to work the following night wrapped in a fragile shell of composure, expecting a summons to Mr. Davies' office and a quiet, humiliating dismissal. Instead, she was met with a chilling, unnatural deference. The staff avoided her eyes, their usual camaraderie replaced by a wide, fearful berth. Mr. Davies himself, who once watched her with predatory scrutiny, now flinched if she came too close, his face a pale mask of anxiety. The tech mogul's regular reservation had been permanently canceled, his name erased from the system as if he had never existed. Ava understood with a cold certainty that this was not a reprieve. It was a mark of ownership, a silent declaration from Julian Thorne that she was now under his protection, which felt less like a shield and more like the walls of a very elegant cage. Her journey home became a source of new anxiety. For 3 nights in a row, she saw it. A sleek black sedan, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, parked across the street from the bus stop. It never moved, its engine a low, patient hum in the quiet of the late hour. It didn't follow her, yet its presence was a constant, unnerving weight on her senses. She knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that he was inside. He was watching her, a silent sentinel guarding a territory he had just claimed. The gesture was meant to feel like security, but to Ava, it felt like surveillance. She was a specimen under his microscope, and the line between guardian and captor was terrifyingly thin. A week later, he appeared at the restaurant again. This time he was alone, seated at the far end of the polished mahogany bar, a solitary figure nursing a glass of dark liquor. He didn't request her service, yet his presence commanded the entire room, pulling the atmosphere taut around him. When she had to pass by to retrieve a bottle, the space between them seemed to crackle with an unseen energy. His eyes, the color of a storm gathering over the ocean, lifted to meet hers. There was no menace in them, only a deep, questioning stillness. He was waiting to see what effect he had on her, and she fought to keep her hands from trembling as she gave a slight professional nod, a small act of defiance that did not go unnoticed. He was breaking all his own rules, and he knew it. Julian Thorne had built his empire on emotional detachment, on the cold, hard logic of power and consequence. Feelings were a liability, a currency for weaker men. Yet he found himself drawn back to this place, to her. He watched her move through the opulent room, a study in quiet grace and unyielding integrity. She was a relic from a world he no longer believed in, a world where honor was not a weakness. This fascination was a dangerous indulgence, an untended fire in the heart of his meticulously controlled fortress. Every instinct screamed for him to sever the connection, to erase her from his thoughts, but he found he was no longer capable of the command. The collision was inevitable. During a chaotic Saturday night service, a flustered busboy, rushing through the narrow pass, stumbled directly into her path. A full tray of crystal flutes went airborne. Ava braced for the impact, a gasp caught in her throat, but before she could fall, a hand shot out, gripping her upper arm with a firm, steadying force. The touch was like a brand, a sudden, shocking heat that seared through the fabric of her uniform. She looked up into Julian Thorne's eyes. He had been on his way out, but he was there, a solid, immovable presence amidst the chaos. For a heartbeat, the noise of the restaurant faded into a dull roar, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the sight of shattered glass at their feet. He released her as quickly as he had caught her, his expression unreadable, but the moment lingered in the air between them, thick with unspoken meaning. His proximity had been an assault on her senses, the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of leather and spice, and the sheer physical power radiating from him. He had simply held her arm, a gesture of instinct, yet it felt more intimate than any embrace she had ever known. He gave a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over her one last time to ensure she was steady before turning and disappearing into the night, leaving Ava standing amidst the wreckage, her skin still tingling where he had touched her, her carefully guarded composure completely undone. Later, in the solitude of her apartment, she found herself tracing the spot on her arm where his hand had been. The memory of his touch was a persistent ghost, a phantom warmth that both terrified and intrigued her. She was losing her grip on the clear, simple lines of her world, where right was right and wrong was a dark, violent territory she was determined to avoid. Julian Thorne was the embodiment of that territory, yet in his eyes she had seen not a monster, but a man burdened by a profound and suffocating loneliness that resonated with her own. This flicker of shared humanity was the most dangerous thing of all, for it threatened to build a bridge across a moral chasm she knew she should never cross. His internal battle was a silent, brutal war. He had spent years constructing an impenetrable facade, a reputation for cold, surgical precision that kept the world at a distance. Ava, with her quiet dignity and defiant eyes, was a sledgehammer to that facade. She represented a purity he had long ago shed, a moral clarity that acted as both a judgment and a temptation. Protecting her was an impulse, a reckless deviation from a life built on calculated risks. He knew that this strange protective instinct was a vulnerability his enemies would not hesitate to exploit. To them, she would be nothing more than a pawn, a lever to use against him, and the thought of his world touching her, tainting her, filled him with a cold, unfamiliar rage. The package that arrived at her door was small, wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a book, a rare leather-bound first edition of a seminal text on the terroir of Burgundy, a book she had once mentioned in passing at the restaurant weeks ago. There was no note, no card, nothing to officially link it to him, but she knew. It was an impossibly intimate gesture, a sign that he not only listened but remembered the smallest details of her quiet dreams. The gift was a testament to his reach, his ability to procure the unobtainable, but it was also a deeply personal intrusion. He was seeing into her soul, and the knowledge left her feeling both cherished and completely exposed. The book felt heavy in her hands, its weight both a comfort and a threat. It was a golden key to a world she desperately wanted, offered by a man who ruled a world she desperately feared. She ran her fingers over the embossed title, the scent of old paper and leather filling her senses. This was not a simple gift. It was a move in a game she didn't understand, a strategic placement of a piece on a board she couldn't see. He was showing her that he could give her the things she dreamed of, but the unspoken price hung in the air, a silent, terrifying contract. To accept his world was to abandon her own, to trade her simple, hard-won integrity for a life in the gilded shadows. Her fear of him began to war with a growing, reluctant fascination. She started to see him not just as a figure of immense power, but a man of profound contradictions. He commanded a violent underworld with chilling efficiency, yet he had protected her with a strange, almost gentle authority. He lived in the darkest corners of the city, yet he had given her a gift that spoke of sunlight, earth, and creation. She began to wonder about the life he lived beyond the walls of the Sterling Grill, about the source of the deep, weary sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He was a puzzle, a dark, intricate mosaic, and she was terrified to find she wanted to piece it together. This new dynamic did not go unnoticed. Mr. Davies, her manager, watched the shift with a mixture of fear and resentment. His authority over her had been neutralized, replaced by the invisible, absolute power of Julian Thorne. For weeks, he kept his distance, his usual harassment sublimated into cold, silent glares from across the room. But power vacuums are always filled, and Davies, perhaps emboldened by a foolish sense of pride or the whispers of one of Thorne's rivals, decided to reclaim his territory. He saw her as the cause of his humiliation, a debt he felt entitled to collect with interest, believing Thorne's attention was a passing whim that had surely faded. He chose his moment carefully, waiting for a quiet Tuesday night when the restaurant was nearly empty. He cornered her in the narrow, dimly lit hallway leading to the back alley as she was leaving. "You think you're special, don't you?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper, his breath sour with cheap wine. "You think he'll protect you forever? He gets bored. They always do." He was close, too close, backing her against the cold brick wall. The familiar, sickening dread washed over her, the feeling of being trapped, of her dignity being stripped away by a petty, cruel man. She stood her ground, her chin high, but her heart hammered against her ribs. His confidence swelled in her silence, mistaking her stoicism for fear. "You work for me," he snarled, his face twisting into an ugly smirk as he reached out, his hand clamping down on her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, greasy and possessive, an act of violation meant to remind her of her place. "And you'll remember who signs your paycheck." The words were a threat, the touch an assault, a crude reassertion of a power he had already lost. Ava's entire body went rigid, a silent scream trapped in her throat as she stared at his hand on her skin, a mark of defilement in a world that had suddenly become much smaller and more dangerous. The heavy steel door to the alley clicked open, swinging inward without a sound. Julian Thorne stepped out of the deep shadows, not as a patron of the restaurant, but as something older and far more primal. He didn't speak, he didn't rush. He simply moved into the weak light of the hallway, his presence sucking all the air from the enclosed space. His gaze, colder and deadlier than she had ever seen it, fell not on her, but on Mr. Davies's hand wrapped around her wrist. In that single, silent, and utterly final look, the manager's smug expression dissolved into one of pure, abject terror. He had not just crossed a line, he had desecrated something sacred. The change in him was terrifying. The controlled, observant man from the dining room was gone, replaced by a predator whose stillness promised swift, absolute violence. His eyes, fixed on Davies, were devoid of any emotion save for a chilling, lethal focus. Ava could feel the shift in the air, the temperature dropping, the silence becoming a physical weight. Davies's hand flew from her wrist as if he'd been burned, and he stumbled back, pressing himself against the opposite wall, his face ashen. Thorne took a slow, deliberate step forward, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness. And in that moment, he had not only stepped into her world, he had brought all of his with him. He stopped directly in front of her, creating a human shield between her and the trembling manager. He still hadn't looked at her, his entire being focused on the threat. Then his hand came up, not to strike, but to gently cup her jaw, his thumb brushing over her cheek in a gesture of profound, shocking tenderness. His touch was a stark contrast to the violence simmering in his eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that was meant only for her. The question was not just about the moment, it was about everything that had led to it. And as she looked into his stormy eyes, she saw the full, terrifying cost of his protection, a price that would now be paid by them both. Her nod was almost imperceptible, a silent answer to his question that meant so much more than yes. It was an acknowledgement of the precipice on which they both stood.
In that moment, she was not a victim seeking rescue. She was a witness, and her stillness was a form of consent to the dark justice about to unfold. Julian Thorne saw this in her eyes, the flicker of defiant understanding that sealed the man's fate. He released her face, the lingering warmth of his touch a stark contrast to the glacial coldness that now settled in his features. He turned, his body a fluid, lethal instrument, and the space between him and the terrified manager compressed into a vacuum where only consequence could exist. The transgression was no longer just his, it was now theirs, a shared secret born in a dimly lit hallway. He did not raise his voice.
His words were a low, precise whisper that cut deeper than any shout. You put your hands on something that does not belong to you. It was not a question, but a final verdict. Before Davies could stammer a reply, Thorne's hand moved with a speed that was almost invisible, a blur of dark tailored wool. He took the manager's offending wrist, not in a grip, but with the precise, detached application of an expert. There was a single, sickeningly wet snap that echoed in the narrow corridor, a sound of bone parting under immense, controlled pressure. Davies crumpled to the floor, a choked, inhuman sound escaping his lips, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. The punishment was swift, silent, and absolute, a chilling display of ownership disguised as retribution. Ava didn't scream. She didn't flinch. A part of her, the part that had endured 1,000 small humiliations, felt a cold, terrible satisfaction. But a larger part of her was frozen in awe and terror at the sheer finality of the act. This was the reality of his world, stripped of its elegant veneer. It was brutal, immediate, and unforgiving. Yet, as Julian stood over the whimpering man on the floor, she saw no pleasure in his eyes, no flicker of sadism. There was only a profound, weary stillness, the look of a man performing a necessary, distasteful task he had performed 1,000 times before. She had broken her own code by not running, by watching, and in doing so, she had stepped fully into his world. He turned back to her, and his eyes, which had been voids of cold fury, were now filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He expected to see disgust, to see the pure, moral light in her finally extinguished by the darkness he had just unleashed. He was prepared for her to recoil, to finally see him as the monster his reputation promised. Instead, she held his gaze, her own eyes wide, not with horror, but with a dawning, complicated understanding. She saw the act for what it was, a desperate, violent attempt to protect the one thing in his world he now considered untainted. She saw the cage of violence he lived in, and for the first time, she felt not fear of the monster, but a deep, aching sorrow for the man. This was his undoing. Her quiet, unwavering gaze was a mirror he could not turn away from. For years, violence had been his language, a tool of control and distance. It was meant to inspire fear, to keep people away, to protect the scarred, hollow space where his heart should have been. But her reaction was not fear. It was empathy. She saw the motive behind the brutality, the protective instinct driving the predator. In her eyes, he did not see his monstrosity reflected, but a glimpse of a man he might have been, a man capable of defending honor. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. In protecting her, he had exposed the one thing he thought long dead, a desperate human need to be seen. The air between them was thick, a supercharged space of unspoken confessions. He took a step toward her, closing the distance he had so carefully maintained his entire adult life. He reached out and took her hand, the one Davies had grabbed, into his own. His touch was nothing like the manager's. Where Davies had been a violation, Thorne's was a sacrament. His fingers, strong and calloused, wrapped around hers with a possessive gentleness that made her breath catch. He lifted her hand slightly, his gaze dropping to it, studying it as if it were a fragile, priceless artifact. It was not a gesture of passion, but of consecration, a silent, binding oath made in the aftermath of violence. The world outside the hallway ceased to exist. He ran his thumb over her knuckles, a slow, deliberate caress that sent a tremor through her entire body. It was a touch that soothed the violation and simultaneously branded her as his. She could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse in his thumb against her skin, a sign of the life that beat beneath his cold, controlled exterior. Looking up from their joined hands, her eyes met his, and in that shared glance, the final walls between them crumbled to dust. He was showing her the truth of his nature, the violence and the tenderness intertwined, inseparable. And she, with her silent, unwavering acceptance, was showing him that she was not afraid of the dark, for she had lived in her own shadows for far too long. He had broken his most sacred rule: never let it be personal. His actions were always business, calculated moves on a vast, bloody chessboard. But this was not business. This was an act of pure, unadulterated instinct, a territorial rage he hadn't felt in decades. He had killed for his empire, but he had just shattered a man's bones for her dignity. The moral calculus of his world had been irrevocably skewed by this one quiet woman who saw the man behind the myth and did not run. He was exposed, vulnerable in a way that no bullet or blade could ever make him. He had protected her from a petty tyrant, but in doing so had unleashed a far greater danger upon them both: his own heart. Slowly, reluctantly, he released her hand, the separation feeling like a physical tearing. The spell was broken, and the cold reality of the world rushed back in. Davies was still a pathetic heap on the floor, a problem to be dealt with. The hallway was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. Julian took a half step back, the mask of cold authority sliding back into place, but his eyes, when they met hers one last time, held the ghost of the man she had just seen. "Go home, Ava," he said, his voice low and strained. It was not a suggestion. It was a desperate plea for her to get to safety, a safety he was no longer sure he could provide now that she was inextricably tied to him. She turned without a word and walked away, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the sudden, ringing silence. She didn't look back, knowing that if she did, she might never be able to leave. The cold night air hit her face as she stepped out onto the street, but it did nothing to cool the fire in her veins. Something fundamental had been broken and remade in that hallway. The man who had been a symbol of fear had become her fierce protector. The act of violence had been the most profound act of intimacy she had ever known. She was no longer just a sommelier fighting for survival. She was the sole witness to a king's transgression, and the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. The day after the incident, the Sterling Grill was a tomb disguised as a restaurant. Mr. Davies was gone, his absence a gaping hole in the fabric of the evening, explained away by a terse, unbelievable story of a sudden family emergency. The staff, who once treated Ava with a mix of pity and professional distance, now moved around her as if she were made of fragile, explosive glass. Their fear was a palpable thing, a new, suffocating atmosphere that clung to her more tightly than the scent of seared steak. She was no longer just Ava, the quiet sommelier. She was a symbol, an unwilling effigy of Julian Thorne's authority, and the deference she now commanded was far more isolating than the contempt she had endured before. Her name was now a whisper tied to his. His withdrawal was as absolute as his presence had been. The black sedan vanished from the corner opposite her bus stop. The restaurant remained unvisited by its most powerful patron. The silence was a physical void, a sudden, jarring cessation of a pressure she hadn't realized she had grown accustomed to. Each night, she would walk home, her senses on high alert, scanning the shadows for a sign of him, a flicker of headlights, anything to prove she had not imagined the strange, violent shield he had placed around her. But there was nothing.
He had retreated completely into his own world, leaving her in the deafening quiet of the aftermath, a ghost haunting the edges of a life he had irrevocably altered and then abandoned. Though she couldn't see it, the consequences of his actions were spreading like fractures through the foundations of his empire. In the clandestine world he commanded, an act of personal violence was a sign of emotional compromise, a fatal flaw. His rivals, men who operated on the cold calculus of profit and loss, saw the incident not as a display of strength, but as a symptom of a dangerous, sentimental weakness. Julian was forced to turn inward, to fight a silent war on multiple fronts, reinforcing alliances and brutally squashing whispers of his vulnerability. His distance from Ava was not a choice, but a strategic necessity, a painful amputation performed to save the whole, and to keep the ensuing gangrene from ever touching her. Ava found herself trapped in the courtroom of her own conscience, replaying the events in the hallway on an endless loop. The sickening crack of bone, the feral darkness in his eyes, followed by that moment of shocking, profound tenderness. She had stood by, a silent witness, and her stillness felt like a form of complicity. A part of her, the part that had been worn down by years of quiet struggle, felt a dark, thrilling sense of justice. But the part of her that still clung to her father's rigid moral code was screaming in protest. She was caught in the gray space between her gratitude and her guilt, and the conflict was slowly eroding the simple black and white world she had once so carefully inhabited. The city itself became a reflection of her inner turmoil. She would stand at her apartment window for hours, watching the rain blur the distant, glittering lights of the skyline into a melancholic tapestry of lost possibilities. The orchid on her windowsill, once a vibrant symbol of her quiet defiance, now seemed to mirror her own fatigue, its petals losing their luster. The solitude of her small room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison cell. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of a connection that had been forged in a single, violent, and unforgettable moment. She was protected by his memory, yet haunted by his absence. One evening, the abstract threat took on a chillingly concrete form. As she stepped off the bus, a different car was idling where his used to be, a nondescript sedan with a man behind the wheel whose face was a blank mask of professional menace. He didn't move, he didn't follow, but his gaze locked onto her, cold and assessing. He was a messenger, and his message was terrifyingly clear. She was no longer invisible. She was a person of interest, a piece on the board, a potential lever to be used against Julian Thorne. The invisible shield he had provided was gone, replaced by a target painted on her back, and the fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. That cold fear, however, did not paralyze her.
Instead, it sharpened her senses, burning away the fog of her confusion and leaving behind a stark, painful clarity. She finally understood the full gravity of his world, the terrible, relentless physics of it, where every action has an equal and opposite reaction. His retreat was not abandonment. It was the only form of protection he had left to offer. He had pushed her away not to discard her, but to place her outside the blast radius of the war he had inadvertently declared in her name. The realization was a quiet agony, a shared burden of a sacrifice she now understood she had to honor by surviving it. In his own self-imposed exile, Julian sat in the cavernous silence of his penthouse office, the city spread beneath him like a carpet fallen stars. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, but the throne felt cold and empty. He had built his world on the principle of emotional detachment, yet the memory of her unwavering gaze in that hallway had breached every one of his defenses. To protect her now required him to become more ruthless, more detached, more of the monster she had refused to see. He had to extinguish the very flicker of humanity she had ignited within him, a slow, torturous process of becoming a stranger to himself all over again, for her sake. With a resolve born of her newfound clarity, Ava knew she could not stay. The Sterling Grill was no longer a place of ambition. It was a stage where her life had been rewritten by someone else.
The next day, she walked through the doors for the last time, not as an employee, but as a free woman. She left her resignation on the bar where he had once sat watching her, a simple, unsigned note that was both a farewell and a release. It was the hardest decision she had ever made, stepping away from the only security she had into a future of complete uncertainty, but it was the only way to truly reclaim the integrity he had fought to defend. Weeks bled into a quiet, colorless month. Ava found a job in a small, unassuming bookstore, the scent of old paper replacing the aroma of vintage wine. The frantic rhythm of the city seemed to fade into a distant hum, but the silence he had left behind was a constant, living presence. It was not an absence of sound, but a space filled with the profound weight of their shared moment, a bond that transcended distance and circumstance. The story of the sommelier and the Mafia boss was over, but the story of Ava and Julian remained, an unspoken question hanging in the quiet air, a ghost of a connection that neither time nor silence could ever truly erase. Autumn painted the city in hues of gold and rust, a soft, melancholic beauty that mirrored the quiet peace Ava had cultivated in her new life. The bookstore was a sanctuary of silence and stories, a world away from the clinking crystal and hushed power of the Sterling Grill. She had found a different kind of dignity here, one that was earned not through flawless service to the wealthy, but through the simple act of placing the right book into the right hands. She was no longer a performer in someone else's opulent play. She was the author of her own small, quiet chapter. And while a phantom ache for a connection she could never name remained, she was, for the first time since her father's death, content in her own skin, breathing air that was finally hers to claim. One rainy Tuesday, a courier delivered a thick, unassuming manila envelope to her small apartment. There was no sender, no note, only the sterile address printed by a machine. Inside, nestled between protective cardboard, was not a threat or a reminder, but a set of legal documents. Her fingers, stained faintly with ink from the bookstore, trembled as she read the dense, formal text. It was a deed paid in full and irrevocably transferred to her name for a small, fallow vineyard overlooking Seneca Lake, a region she had once described with wistful passion to a silent, listening man. The property was modest, neglected, but its potential, like a dormant seed, lay waiting under the cold, rich soil, a dream she had long ago buried. She sank onto her small sofa, the papers spread across her lap, a map to a future she had never believed possible. This was his language, not of flowers or apologies, but of power wielded with surgical, silent precision. This was not a gift meant to bind her to him, but an act of profound and absolute release. He was not giving her a gilded cage, he was giving her the earth itself, a place where she could cultivate life, where her hands could create something true and lasting. It was his penance, his only way of restoring the balance his violence had upended. He was setting her free by giving her roots, an act of redemption so complete and selfless it took her breath away, leaving a hollow, aching space in her chest where gratitude and sorrow met. Drawn by an instinct she didn't understand, she pulled on her coat and walked out into the steady, cleansing rain. The city was a blur of hazy lights and hurried reflections on the wet pavement. She clutched the envelope to her chest, a fragile shield containing a new world. As she waited at a crosswalk, the rhythmic pulse of the traffic lights washing the street in red and white, she felt it. The familiar, intense weight of a focused gaze. She lifted her head, and her heart stopped. Across the street, standing half hidden in the deep shadows of an old brownstone's archway, was Julian Thorne.
He was alone, without the armor of his car or his men, just a man in a dark coat, watching her from across an impassable river of rain and traffic. Their eyes met, and in that single, suspended moment, the entire roaring city fell silent. There was no fear left in her, only a deep, painful, and complete understanding. His face, usually a mask of cold control, was stripped bare by the distance and the rain, revealing the profound, weary loneliness of a king in a self-imposed exile. He saw her holding the deed, and in her eyes he found not obligation or fear, but the absolution he had not known he was seeking. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a final gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of goodbye. Then, without another moment's hesitation, he turned and dissolved back into the shadows from which he came, leaving her alone on the corner, finally and truly free. She stood there long after he was gone, the rain mingling with the silent tears on her cheeks, clutching the promise of a new life born from the ashes of his dark world. He had given her back her dream, and in doing so, had found a sliver of redemption in the wreckage of his own soul. Their story was not one of love, but of a rare, violent, and beautiful humanity found in the most impossible of places. If you believe a single act of grace can echo through the darkness, and that everyone deserves a chance to cultivate their own garden, then let this story be a reminder. Share it with those who need to see it, like this video, and tell us in the comments what you believe will grow from the seeds of their sacrifice.